Welcome everyone to come on. All right. Now we're starting. Now we're starting the episode. All right. Welcome everybody to Tableau Coders Initiative. This is season 2, episode 4 of 5, where we're talking about the embedding API. A lot of these slides you've gotten these before, but my name is Zach Geis. Alongside Kyle, run this initiative. I'm a data dev ambassador of Tableau Visionary, do a bunch of other things. Kyle's over there too, if you care. So welcome to the initiative. We appreciate you guys joining, as always. Our goal, as always, is to teach others to code with the Tableau APIs and developer tools while fostering a safe and friendly environment for users of all skill levels.
Hey Zach, I'm not
We
sure
are
if it's just me. I still see the title slide. Is it
So
progressing?
you waited like 4 slides, so tell me that. Okay, thank you.
You were in a groove. I didn't want to. There you go.
Here's
There you
here's
go. Now,
you just wanted to let me get through the groove to a point where you could bring it. I get it. This
yeah,
is
exactly.
us.
You
I
got it.
did that. Welcome to the initiative. This is the goal that I just mentioned. You've heard it before. So the roadmap. So right now we're on part 2, potentially 5 parts. We don't know. We're just kind of winging it at this point. We did the REST API already last year. This is, as mentioned, the 4th part of the embedding API. And we expect one more episode of this, and we'll be wrapping up with the embedding API. Data dev updates, there are none. We checked. We were hoping there were some updates that we could share with you guys, but nothing new right now. As always, we do encourage you to check out tableau.com/developer. That's where you can find the latest information about the developer program, what's new or not, what's going on with the APIs, things like that. And yeah, so I'm going to pass it over to Kyle, and we'll see if I can mess him up a couple times.
I can't wait. Morning, everybody. So, as Zach's saying, so our recap for the last session, which was a couple weeks ago, we dove in with CSS and we took our interactive resume example that we had started building in the beginning of the series and showed off some of the things we can do by adding CSS, like rounded corners, doing some styling, making some little interactive elements that happen when we hover, things like that. So if you want to review that, again, that entire session is on YouTube at the link below. We'll make sure that the slides are available. You can also find it on YouTube by just looking up Tableau Coders. And in the video notes, we will have links to the CodePen examples, so you can follow along if you weren't able to join live last time. So we'll kind of build on some of that and look back at some of the CSS when we go through our examples today. But Zach, if you want to go to the next slide. So today we're going to introduce JavaScript. And if you've been using Tableau for a while and have had interest in embedding before, the embedding API that we built this series around used to be called the JavaScript API because it is an API that uses JavaScript. So they just gave it that name. And then starting with version 3, they've started calling it the embedding API. So it's important to have some foundational knowledge of what JavaScript is in order to really start wrapping our heads around using an API such as the embedding API. So just what is JavaScript? I thought this definition, which is from Mozilla, which are the people who make the Firefox browser, if you didn't know. JavaScript is a programming language that allows you to implement complex features on web, etc. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the most interesting part that I thought was the second part here was every time you go to a web page and it does something other than just show you information, something in the realm of 98 to 99% of the time, JavaScript is involved in one way, shape, or form. So it's important to kind of start and have a basic understanding of what JavaScript is and what it does. And as they say here, and kind of we've been using the analogy of a house throughout. The HTML is your walls and your foundation, CSS is the paint and the styling, and JavaScript is the electricity. They use a similar analogy here of it being the third layer of the cake, along with HTML and CSS. The point is, the 3 things that we've been discussing, we're going to start putting them all together and really start making things happen here. And just kind of as I alluded to, JavaScript is huge. It's everywhere. Knowing some JavaScript will take you far no matter what you want to do on the web. So it's a good place to start. Just some notes. JavaScript, if you're Googling or doing learning on your own, JavaScript comes in a lot of different flavors. You'll see things like TypeScript and CoffeeScript and jQuery and all these kind of specialized versions of JavaScript. We're going to be focusing on vanilla JavaScript, so JavaScript that you can use everywhere. But don't get thrown off if you see some examples of people doing it different ways under different names. It all kind of started in the same place. JavaScript is also combined a lot with other technologies, like NPM is something you might come across, and combined into frameworks. We've kind of alluded to things like React or Vue.js or Angular. These are all considered JavaScript frameworks that combine everything into one package or one way of building components that's powered by JavaScript, but lets you do your HTML and CSS at the same time. We'll probably talk a little bit more about some of those things in the next session when we really start combining everything together and getting into what we can really do with Tableau's embedding API. And just a final disclosure here. JavaScript, I mean, people's entire careers every day are built around JavaScript. So a full course on JavaScript is way beyond what we could offer in an hour. But we're going to try to introduce some fundamentals and just try to help get the gears turning. But if you are interested, this link at the bottom has a ton of different places you can go to learn JavaScript and learn more about JavaScript for free. There's paid resources like Udemy and Pluralsight, whatever your interest level is. If you want to expand on it, I recommend that link for resources. So Zach, I think it's time for me to jump on over to CodePen. So I am going to I'm going to send a link in the Zoom chat here. And this is a link to a collection of pens in CodePen that I'm going to be sharing from. And so that if you want to, Zach, can you make me a host again so I can share, please?
Yep.
So if you're interested in following along, we're going to start with these pens and I'm kind of fill them out and save them. And then after the session, they'll be filled out. And if you want to go back and take a look at them, walk through them again with the video, you can certainly do that. So let me share this screen. Okay. So if you're following along and you have the collection pulled up here, what I want you to do first is click on the pen titled here, JavaScript Hello World. So if you're familiar with any other code languages, Hello World is typically the first kind of message you give or have it do something involving Hello World. So JavaScript, if you want to go ahead and see how I've got it here, we don't need the HTML or the CSS panes for this, so you can pull them up and give yourself maximum room for JavaScript if you want. So JavaScript has a couple different ways that you can basically output messages or print things to a console. So the first one is just called an alert. So if you want to follow along here, if I type in the word alert, which is a function, and I will give it just a message here, and I can just say, hello world. Now you'll see this, I have the console open and it's kind of going live as I do it. It's giving me errors because I didn't close this off. But as soon as I close this off, I get an alert from the browser that says hello world. So a very simple example. You still see sites that use alerts for things. You click on something, you maybe forgot something in a form. There's still lots of sites that use this. So it's a way to inform your user of something they need to do or didn't do. One thing to note, an alert stops everything. So I can't click on anything else in the page until I dismiss that alert. So that's one way that we can output a message if we want the user to see it. Maybe we want, and I'm going to add some, these double slash notation here makes the line a comment. So I don't want it to keep showing me that alert, but I want to leave it in the pen. So that's why I'm doing that. If you're in this and you do not see this console in your section, or sorry, in your session of the pen, go ahead and click on this console button in the lower left so you'll be able to see what we're doing here. So this is a way for us to output a message that we can see or review. It's good for debugging and things like that, but it's not going to show to the user right away, and it's not going to stop the user from doing anything. So if I want to have a message here that I'm using for logging or making sure something's working, I can type in console.log, and then I give it my message. And I will again here do hello world. And you'll see it'll update in a second here. And now I've got a printed message here that I can see, but it didn't interrupt the user experience. So a couple different ways of alerting or logging messages just to get started. One thing to know, like I said, CodePen is updating like every second after I put in input. So it's trying to interpret things before I'm finished. That's why you're seeing some errors there. We'll talk about that more in a second. So if I go back now to the collection, we'll do something, or actually, sorry, let me save this first. If I go back to the collection, we want to jump into the second example called basic math and logic. So we'll start showing how to do some basic math and things like that in JavaScript. So same thing here. I've got the HTML and CSS panes squished up because I'm not going to use them for this example. And I've got some comments showing a few different things that we can do here in this example. Now, first thing you'll notice at the top is I have two vars or variables. I've got number 1 and number 2. Really doesn't matter what value they are for our example here, but so if you want to change them to show your own example, go for it. I'll talk about, we won't go too far into declaring variables in JavaScript. There's different scopes. So if you think about something like order of operations in Tableau, there are different ways that you can declare a variable, and the scope is different. So you might see var or let or const. They're just different scopes. They're not really important for what we're doing now, but if you run into them in the wild, it's worth doing a little bit more reading on to make sure that you understand scope of variables. But for this simple example, var is just fine. So let's look at how I can sum these two numbers. So I am going to use a console log again, just so that we can see this here. So if the console is not showing for you, go ahead and click on the console button here in the lower left. And another thing I did in this pen, just to kind of show you what CodePen can do as well, if you click on the settings for this pen and go to behavior. Excuse me, I'm sorry, go to editor. No, I'm sorry, where did my option go? Okay, sorry, yes, behavior, my bad. If you go to the behavior setting, auto updating preview. This is what was firing like every second before and giving me errors because I wasn't done typing. So if we turn that off, what I end up with is a run button. So now this pen won't do anything until I hit run. Makes it a little cleaner, a little easier to follow along. So I'm going to go ahead and type in my console.log because I know I'm going to need that as well. And now inside this console.log, before I just gave it some text and told it to log, but I can give it functions, I can give it methods, I can give it things to do. So what I'm going to do here is just say, I want you to log number 1 plus number 2. Just like that. And when I hit run, we'll see that I get 275. Obviously, number 1 plus number 2. The inverse of that is going to seem pretty simple, but I can do number 2 minus number 1, and now I'll get 2 outputs here, one after the other, of the sum and then the difference. Let's look at how we might look at whether or not a number is odd or even, which is sometimes, we want to know things like that. We'll use what's called the modulo function, which some people might be familiar with because it exists in Tableau as well. And is essentially what this is checking for is whether or not a number, when we divide it by 2, has a remainder, which is essentially what defines whether or not a number is odd or even. So I'll start with the word if. And in JavaScript, our conditions for if, following the if, are always in parentheses. So I will say, let's take a number that I know is even in this example. So number 1. If I say that my variable number 1, our % represents modulo by 2. And then if I say that that is equals to 0, meaning that it does not have a remainder, then we will console log even. And these curly brackets are what we put our actions in. So I've got my if, my condition, and then the curly brackets say if this condition is met, do whatever is inside of them. So if my logic is correct and this is an even number, then we should get a log of even. So I'm going to clear this console here, get rid of some of the old stuff, and then I'm going to hit run. and I get the first two console logs, and I get an even. So, so my logic there for an even number worked out. What happens then if I do number 2? So if I run this through, logic says 175 is not an even number. So if I run this, you'll see now I only get my first 2 prints because I didn't supply an else condition here. So if I want to, and I just, this is just an if else, there's no else if something is either odd or even. But if I wanted to add else if all the way down, it's kind of like you would in a Tableau calculation, I could do this for as many branches of logic as I want. In this case, it's odd or even, so I can add in my else case odd. And same as before, I give it my condition here is else. And so what to do afterwards is inside another set of curly brackets. And if I hit run on this one, now number 2 is odd. So very basic example of how to do some math and how to do some very simple logic checks in JavaScript. Like I said, if you're doing research in the wild, there's lots of other ways you might find people doing similar things. All the basic math is here, so I could have done an asterisk for multiplication, division, things like that. That stuff's pretty straightforward, and pretty much what you would expect. So I'm going to save this example, and we will hop back to our collection here. So now let's start making JavaScript do some stuff with a web page, right? That's what we're really interested in. So I'm going to go to the one here called basic button click action. If we open up this pen, so we do have some HTML, some very basic HTML and some CSS here. So just to cover what we see here. If you remember last time we started talking about divs and how they relate to CSS here. So I've got a div that is called outer. I've got a couple buttons, and inside of that outer div, I have another div with an ID of inner. Notice that you don't see that where I have a headline inside of there. We don't see that because if we look at the CSS, I've got a border and some padding and a width constraint on the outer div, but on the inner div, I've set it to display as none. And that's because I want it to be toggled on and off, and I want its default state to be off. So right now, you don't see it. And these buttons are actually doing stuff now. I must have saved this inadvertently, but I'll get rid of this and we'll talk through it. So pretend that didn't happen. We'll actually rewrite these functions again. So now if I click on show hide, the buttons don't do anything, or they're calling functions that don't exist. So let me back this up here. I apologize. Okay, so now we are back at a state where we have just our HTML, just our CSS, and we have one constant in the JavaScript at the bottom. So focusing on the JavaScript on the bottom, I have a constant called toggle div, and that is my inner div. So this is a very, very common way of getting elements within your page. You'll see this everywhere is document.getElement by ID. That ID corresponds to the ID attribute of any element in my HTML. So I'm saying that from now on JavaScript, and because I used a constant, it's scoped at the entire module, so I can use it over and over and over again. Anytime I refer to toggle div, I'm talking about this item, and JavaScript understands that. So let's talk about how we can make stuff happen with this toggle div. So let's say we want 2 things to happen from here, right? We have 2 buttons. We want a button to show it, and we want a button to hide it. So the first thing, let's talk about how we would write a function in JavaScript to show it. So starting a function in JavaScript, start with the word function. Then I'm going to give the function a name. It doesn't really matter, but I'm just going to call it show div, like this. This function, this open close parentheses would be if the function needed to take any arguments. These are very simple. They do not. So we'll just do open close. And then our functions in JavaScript are also just kind of like we saw before, lots of curly brackets in JavaScript. So once I declare the function this way, anything I do inside of it will happen when I call it. So in this case, I want to toggle div. And in a tie-in here to CSS is I've got the display styled as none. So if I want to change that, all I need to do is toggle div dot style dot display. And in this case, I want it to display as a block when it's shown, which just means it occupies the whole row that it's on in the document. So the inverse of that, if I want to be able to show, excuse me, to hide the div, I'll create another function called hide div. Again, no arguments, open and close with our curly brackets. And this time I'll do toggle div dot style dot display equals none, basically setting it back to what it is by default. So now I've identified my div that I want to interact with a constant, and I've got two functions to show and hide it. But notice though, the buttons don't do anything yet because I didn't tell them. JavaScript's like, okay, you've got this function, but there's nothing to trigger these actions yet. So this is very easy, and this used to be harder. Modern browsers, modern JavaScript has made this a lot easier. So if I go up to my buttons here inside of the HTML portion of the pen, and I just, after the word button, I add an action, and in this case, it'll be called on click equals, and then in parentheses, because it is an attribute, I will give it just the name of the function. Show div for show. And if I go down here to my hide button, and do on click equals hide div. And notice I'm calling it with the parentheses here, again, because it is a function. It just doesn't have any arguments. So now with that added, if I click on show, my div shows up. If I click on hide, it hides. So a very simple example of what you can do, but you can start imagining how you can make buttons toggle things, show different panes. You can incorporate things like CSS transitions and make things slide in and out. You can really start making a lot of stuff happen just with about 7 lines of code here. So that is an example of starting on some interactivity. Let's look at another example of how we can manipulate and use what's on the page within our code here. So I'm going to switch to the next pen in the collection, which is called simple inputs. And we'll look at this one. And real quick review of what's on the screen. Basically, I have a div that has some additional divs in it just for line breaking and things. But essentially, we're most interested in, I have an input here, number 1, and an input number 2, and then I have a button. And the button is calling a function called doMath. Some basic CSS here just to keep things in line, but we're not really going to worry about that as much this time around. So let's review what this one is, what's in the code for this one, and see how it works. So I've got another constant here at the beginning of the JS, and this time I'm calling it sum div because I'm summing 2 numbers in this example. And if we look at the code, again, this ID, get element by ID, refers to an ID of some portion, some element on our page, and it just happens to be this div down here. So notice right now it doesn't have anything in it, so we don't see anything. But I'm saying that I want this to be my sum div, and then my function called doMath. I'm basically getting number 1 and number 2 by doing get element by ID again. And in this case, in this example, these elements are inputs, so they're text boxes. They could be, they could be larger text boxes. They could be buttons. These are inputs of the type equaling text, so they're just little boxes that you're used to typing in all over the internet. So in this case, I can just call the dot value of the element. So value being whatever's in the box, and then the last line of sum div, or sorry, of doMath, is saying that the HTML, the inner HTML, so starting here in this div called sum div, should be equal to the number 1 plus number 2. Now I've wrapped these in a standard function called parse int, which would be like the int function in Tableau and a lot of other places, because the default value for these boxes is a string. And if I try to add 2 strings together, just like in Tableau or anywhere else, it'll yell at me and say, hey, you can't do that. But by explicitly casting them to an integer, I can make this work. So if I do an example here of, let's just do 100 plus 500, I don't know. As soon as I click on the calculate button, which if we look at this like last time, I have a button with an on click that's calling my function named doMath. So as soon as I click on this, my sum shows up now in this div called SumDiv. I can do anything. I can tease it and put in negative numbers. It's just doing very simple sums of the values of these two boxes. All right, so now we've seen how we can get some basic input and pass it from one place to another. Another example that'll come up a lot when we get into the embedding API is a little bit more going down the path of an advanced topic, but it's important to just understand basically what they are. So the next set of examples, or the next sample that we'll look at is in the collection is called Event Listeners Color Changer. So I'll talk about this. I'll talk about what event listeners are, and then we'll talk into that. We'll get into this. So event listeners in JavaScript, as the name sort of implies, are a way almost for you to subscribe to an element and have JavaScript react when something happens. So I can say I'm interested in this black element in the pen here, and I want something to happen when a certain event happens. I could do things for the entire page. I can do things for any element that has a specific class in CSS. So event listeners are very, very, very powerful, and they're what let you make things happen without having to explicitly put a trigger on every single thing. And that'll make more sense in a second here. But let's just take a quick look at what's going on in our CSS and HTML here, and then we'll dive into what we're doing with event listeners in this example. So this is a pretty simple example HTML-wise. We've got an outer div, we have a headline, and then we have a color bar with some divs that are just occupying space and have some background colors. So you see some a black one, a blue one, and a red one. They're just there to show the colors of their background. CSS, we've got some width constraints, flex to make them show in a straight line. None of this is too big onto what we need to look at, but I've got my black, my blue, and my red. This is where the background color comes into effect. So basically, I'm just almost creating a color palette of sorts, very simply. So jumping down to what we want to do with the JavaScript here, I think what would be nice here is almost like hovering over and getting a preview of what this text would look like in the various colors. That's a silly example, but it's a good way to see what event listeners can do. So at the top, like in the other examples, I have constants for all of the divs that are going to come into play here. So my div named headline, black, blue, and red, I just have changed those into variables that I can call instead of having to repeat document.get element by ID over and over again. So just getting that ready for me here. And we'll look at actually these functions that are very simple first, and then we'll add in an event listener and see what they do here. So I see three functions. We've got set to black, set to blue, and set to red. And all we're really doing here is my headline. Again, headline doesn't have a color defined in the CSS by default, so it just defaults to black. But you can see here what I'm doing in each one of these is just saying headline.style.color, and then adding blue, black, or red. These are standard colors I can call by name. I could do hex codes for colors, whichever. But now let's talk about, so how do we make stuff happen when we interact with these divs? And that's where an event listener will come into play. So if I go down here and start a new line, and I'm going to start with the blue div just because it'll show a difference. So if I type in the name of my constant, blue div, dot, and then I'm going to add event listener, spelled out like that. Pay attention to your case in JavaScript. It's what's called camel case. So the first letter should be lowercase, and then every word after that should be capitalized. So you see a lowercase a and then capital E, capital L. So I add event listener, and this function takes a couple of things. And so first thing it wants is what event am I listening for? So in this case, I want it to be the hover, or when someone puts their mouse over it, that event is just called mouse over. So if I do it like that, that tells me add an event listener to this event. It's yelling at me because I'm not done yet. And then the next argument here is what do I want it to do when that event is detected for this element. So this is the blue div. So what I want to happen there is I want to set to blue. So now I got, let's see what happened here. Excuse me, sorry. There we go. So now you can see, let me save and refresh. I moused over by mistake. So the default state of this is with the headline being black. I'm waiting for it to refresh here. Sorry, here we go. And now, because I've added this event listener to the blue div and said when a mouse over occurs, set headline style to blue, as soon as I run my mouse over that, it turns to blue. Now, if I want to make this a little bit more interactive, what I can do is add event listeners to the black div. So I'll do a similar thing here and do add event listener on the mouse over and set to black. Lastly, I'll do the similar thing to for the red div and say red div, add event listener, mouse over, and I'll set that and call set to red. So now with all of those things combined, I end up with something like this, where as I hover over the different things, you can see it instantly updates based on the element and the function that I've told it to call when that action occurs, or when that event occurs, excuse me. And you can go really crazy with these things. You can add multiple events to the same element. You can, like I mentioned, you can add class-based event listeners, so that, let's say I hover over the red bar and I have a web page. I want to preview what a bunch of different elements would look like in the same color, or grown or shrank or transformed by the same amount. Basically, anything that you could do with JavaScript, event listeners will let you make it happen given a certain prerequisite. And I think that's definitely going to come into play when we talk about the embedding API and in Zach's example here in a couple minutes. So Zach, I believe that takes me to the end of my example. Let me double check on the slides, but I think that was it. So I think I'm going to pass it back over to Zach, who's going to show us, we're going to start putting some of this together with actual embedding examples.
Kind of. All right, cool. Thanks, Kyle. Let me share my screen again. You got to make me a host.
You are a host. Sorry, I was talking to you on mute.
All right. Share my screen. And you should see it now. So yes, as Kyle just went through those, just a reminder, what Kyle has shown is available in CodePen. You can find it in collection YYJBBBA. To remember that. So now I'm going to take over. And what I want you to do is just forget everything that this guy just told you. So we're going to do something a little bit different. You can just ignore all the things that Kyle went through, and we're going to go, somewhere a little different now. So we're going to focus on the Tableau embedding playground. So we've mentioned this, I think, a couple times during the sessions, probably more in the beginning. There is something that the Tableau developer program and people at Tableau themselves have created for mostly beginner users of the embedding API to build things in more of a UI friendly method, more drag and drop friendly. So I'm going to show that. What I'm going to show is something that you can leverage yourself. If you go to developer.salesforce.com/tools/tableau/embedding-playground, another easy to remember link. But let me go ahead and move over my browser. So this is the Tableau embedding playground. This is, as mentioned, something that Tableau themselves have developed for people to play with. The goal here is to have a graphical drag and drop friendly environment to build code. The goal here is to, limit the knowledge necessary to start on these things, reduce kind of the skills necessary, and just give you somewhere where you can play around and learn a little bit about this. This is technically still in early access. It's not something that they regularly promote or update as of today, but it is something that they're investing resources. This was announced at the Salesforce developer conference this year, TDX, and also promoted a little bit in the Tableau conference as well.
I did see, Zach,
So,
a message from Avald, one of the developers at Tableau, that it is going to go into GA relatively soon here. So,
okay, cool. So hopefully here soon it'll go GA. One of the big things you can't do right now is swap out the URL that you use. So you're kind of stuck with what they have built in there. But I'll show you a couple things. So let's go ahead and show you what's going on here. So basically what happens is you have a preview of your dashboard or whatever you're kind of developing inside of it through the embedding API up here at the top. You have your JavaScript and your HTML components down below. And then over on the left side is where you can take components, change settings, things like that. And so a couple things I can do, I can change this. Maybe, for example, I want to make this 100 by 100 just to make it look terrible. You'll see over here, the changes are highlighted. So over in the HTML, not a lot happening here. This is really where it's just starting this component. The width of 100, height of 100 looks terrible, like I said. So let's undo that. Just simple things I can do there. Get a little bit more advanced here in the customized display where you can modify a couple settings, mostly focused on tabs and toolbar. So very quickly, I can check to show the tabs. This is a bad example because there actually are no tabs here, but if there were, it would show tabs at the top. And we take this off. So you'll see when I uncheck it, I add this hide tabs line right here. Same thing with the toolbar. So right now it's showing in the bottom. You can see that there's a toolbar right here. I move this to the top. See very simple things. You can play around with these things as well. I can just say, let's put this. Well, this is this one. I can't. You can add in the JavaScript. I guess you can't add the HTML. I'll show you. So just easy things. Move the tabs. This is where it gets a little bit more advanced, where you can add interactions, and these are very much focused on the embedding API. You'll notice in the JavaScript section, there's all the code that you need to get this going. But at the bottom, they have a little placeholder comment, as we showed before, where you can add little snips below this. So, for example, they have some example code here for context menu. So, add a custom context menu item to the tooltip. The context menu to perform custom actions based upon Mark's data. And so what I can do is I can take this little object, I can drag it over here to my code, and then you'll see it actually pop up with the explainer inside of the comments on what's happening and the code itself. So, it's nothing crazy. This is maybe, what is that? Probably about 30 lines, maybe more like 15 lines of actual code to get this done, but I don't have to code it. I can just drag and drop. And what this does is I can actually, well, let me run it first. I'm running that code down below. Notice nothing looks any different. But now when I select a series of marks, you'll see I've got this little option in here. Typically, I would just have keep only exclude in the little details button, view data. But now I have something called actions. I hit actions, and you'll see I have an option to run my app. It says developer, hey, action taken. This is just a test. If it had been a real action, something else would have happened. 83 items selected. So, for example, this could be something where maybe you send these to a database and say, hey, update these, or you send them to your browser to show it inside of your actual browser, the 83 things that you've selected. This is just a very simple example of what you can do. Just drag and drop over here. I'll go ahead and clear this out. So we'll clear back up to the add code. Go through a couple other examples. So context menus, we did that. Export, creates a data table reader for the summary data and returns all pages. So let's see what that does. We drag this over and we hit run. And kind of similar, saying right now there are 631 rows of data here. Summary data table is the name, and we got that. So again, the ability to basically pass data and information about the data from Tableau to your browser. And this comes in handy when you want to build actual applications that do things. You can undo things in here. Well, since I ran it, I can't undo it, but typically you can use some of the typical shortcuts like Control Z, things like that to delete things or undo things rather. There are other things you can apply a filter. This is a good example. So maybe what I want to do is apply a filter. I want to select this and we'll hit run and we'll look into this one a little bit more in detail. So it pops up, but then secondarily it filters to the east region over here. And so you can see this is an example of what you can do in the code. This is a lot more simple than the others that we showed, where it's really just apply a constant filter name, wait for this to happen. You know, Kyle was talking about those actions and how they work. Passing the region and what is the value. So very easily I could just say, let's make it west. If I could type that right. So let's make that west and let's run that. And this time I'm just going to flip and now it's going to look at, surprise, surprise, the west region. What I might want to do after that is clear the filter. So let's clear that filter after. So you'll see kind of a series of events happen. So it's going to grab it, then it's going to filter, then it's going to clear it. So it's very, makes sense. Something you'd want to do. Being sarcastic. All right, so let's go up here. Let's take this out. Maybe do one more quick example. This is an example where you can select certain marks. So we drag that in there and let's see what happens. So we got field name of state, Pasadena, Texas, Washington, California. And you can see the kind of setup here of how this works. Very similar as far as, basically this is what we're doing and this is what we're applying it to. And this is what we're actually applying. So we hit run and selected some random marks. Yay. There's other things in here. You can apply dashboard filters. This is applying to all the sheets in the dashboard. There's kind of the premise of doing things on a sheet or across sheets in the Embedding API. And then some other things with parameters, changing parameter values. I'm not going to get into all that right now. What I did want to show very quickly is let's go. This is fine. We can keep this. We can always take this, like I mentioned, this is kind of light as far as features right now. It is something they're still adding more to it. But one of the things you probably would want to do is do some of the stuff on your own bits. So what you can do for now, until all of that is opened up, is just let's take this, go over to pens, Coped. So we can take this, we can throw this in the JavaScript. We can take the little bit over here from the HTML, copy that, put that in the HTML, and then once this runs, we get the same kind of setup here in Coped. And so we can, start to build this out, and potentially we can take the dashboard. Here's a beautiful, beautiful work of art somebody built. We'll go back over here and you'll see inside of our HTML, we've got this link. And let's paste that over here into the source. And lo and behold, we've got this beautiful work of art over here in Coped now. And so now I can start to work with this on my own stuff. I can play with the same filters, see what I can do. So definitely something I would encourage you, again, to check out on this website. Play around with it in Coped, use your own workbook, your own dashboard inside of Public or Tableau Cloud or whatever, and just play around with some of these features. This is, I think, a good way to get out of just writing code and maybe not always learning what it does. I think there's something to be said about doing things in a drag and drop friendly route where you can see what you're going to have, what you're going to apply to the code before actually writing it. And then you can kind of take it apart piece by piece and see how you can modify different attributes and settings. Some people learn better that way. So I think I'll stop there and we'll kind of close out the session and see if we got a few minutes for questions at the end. So again, here's that URL, developer Salesforce tools, Tableau embedding playground. And let's talk a little bit about our next and final session for the embedding API. So next we'll kind of combine everything. So we focus primarily on, session 1 was our intro, session 2 was HTML, session 3 was CSS, session 4 was JavaScript. Let's kind of take things and put them together and talk about how that works. We'll finish our resume example. So we'll do a little bit more JavaScript next session in 2 weeks and focus on taking the resume that I originally created that Kyle butchered with his CSS, and that we'll kind of bring it back on track with the JavaScript.
I love these sessions.
Yeah, they're great. They're a big booster for you, I know. And then we'll move away from CodePen. So we talked about this a little bit in the first session. Typically, you're not going to use CodePen for like real projects. That's more for playing around, testing things. And then we'll wrap up and talk about what's next. So I will stop there and we'll see what kind of questions you guys got.
Yeah, feel free to just come off a mute or send them in the chat, whatever you are more comfortable with.
And I know it's Friday, so questions are not required.
Hey guys, it's Pam. I have a couple of observations / questions.
Yeah.
I've been playing with the code. I started out with putting one workbook on a web page, and then I'm thinking, okay, what crazy things are my users going to ask me for? Because they will. So I actually added another workbook, and I've got interaction between items on the web page interacting with the workbooks. I've got the workbooks kind of interacting with each other. And one observation I had was that, like the embedding playground code, it uses that Tableau viz element, but because I'm using 2 workbooks, I had to do the instantiate a new object for each one of those vizzes, which I got working fine. So I think I'm good there. My biggest issue right now is, again, thinking, what could the user possibly throw at me? So I've got some things where I am using, let me just try to look at my code, the adding an event listener of the mark selection changed. From the one workbook so that I can actually select marks on the other workbook. That works, except that, like, if I also have some interaction going on the first workbook, basically I'm trying to, let me just think here a second. Kind of look at my code as I talk, so I remember what I'm trying to do here. So basically I guess what I'm trying to do is, rather than just get when the event fires on the workbook, I need to be able to distinguish what specific worksheet on the dashboard has been fired, because otherwise it's kind of like doing a double firing. Anyway,
I more or less know the struggle you're describing, Pam. It can be tricky, and even if you dig deep into the documentation, especially for, it seems like version 3, the embedding API is a little bit trickier with those than even the JavaScript API. It can be tricky to figure out which sheet caused the action, like you have to dig pretty deep. And it's probably something where if we want to connect offline, I'm happy to walk through how
Yeah, I
solved
figured
a
I'd
similar
just
issue.
mention it today, so
Yeah.
that everybody's got any ideas. Because I see, you know, I was digging around a bunch of different places and I saw some different things, and I guess even including on the embedding playground, it talks about using like the mark selected await for on a specific sheet, but that's not really what I want. I need to, you know, be able to have you know, when an event happens.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those. It's always it's hard to see in just talking theoretically, but happy to
Right.
connect and take a look,
Yeah.
because I've had similar issues, and I won't always
Yeah.
say that the fix is elegant, but you can make it work.
And, you know, as I mentioned before, you know, I haven't done like really any, you know, web development in a long time. I mostly been sticking to the, you know, reporting tools like Tableau or whatever I was using before. So, you know, but I mean, I'm still a coder, so it's easy for me to use the logic. It's just using this V3. I'm trying to figure out how to get things working the way I want them to. So anyway, yeah, there's probably a lot of messy stuff going on, but like I said, I pretty much got it working other than that one issue.
That's awesome, though. Just getting that
Yeah.
far is an accomplishment. That's awesome.
Well, you know, I like this is how I became a programmer. Is I'll beat my head against the wall and I'll start to say, well, maybe I should stop. And then I don't stop until I finally figure it out. So
Yeah.
That's classic programmer behavior. Here
yeah.
you are a coder. I do see. I just saw a couple questions in the chat. Joe, does Tableau plan to roll out more API frameworks similar to ArcGIS with rich APIs for several programming languages of developers' choice? I don't really know if Zach and I can necessarily speak directly to that. I know that Tableau, really throws a lot of its resources behind its REST API and its Python solutions. So I would say those are definitely not going anywhere. But I'm sure out in the community, there are people who have developed solutions for other languages, probably like Java or Go, things like that. But if you stick to the REST API, you'll probably always have the most available functionality and just making API calls through whatever language you want to use. And then Mo, I had looked at this before, or so no, sorry, Hassan. I had looked at this before. Zach just pulled it up. I don't know if we'll be able to log in and see everything, but this is cool. Zach, can you pull that back up? That is really cool. I'm not sure if we're able to see anything because if it's in your developer sandbox. But I like this. This is slick.
Yeah, agreed.
Yes.
Yeah, and so if you put this on Tableau Public, so if you use Tableau Public dashboards, we'd be able to actually see it. Since it's Tableau Cloud, we're not going to be able to see it.
Yes, I see. I can see that's it's my site. Okay. The issue is that I have created an API on Flask. I have hosted it on Python Anywhere and used the tokenize to sign in for it. But I have issue with Safari. With Safari browser, it didn't work with that. Chrome worked perfect. I don't know the issue. Also, I have another doubt regarding the background of the chart itself. I couldn't manage to change it using the code. So I don't know what I can do with that.
So, okay, I see your message there. So, so changing the actual background color of a chart inside of a workbook or inside of a dashboard, is that what you're referring to?
Yes, to change it in the code, yes, itself, yes.
Okay, that's full honestly or transparency. It's not something I think I've ever tried to do. There's an extension out there called Tab CSS that tries to address some of this stuff. I haven't played around with it a lot, but that might be helpful if you want to look into that. beyond that, it might be one of those features. If you look in the release notes and the documentation for embedding API, it does say that there's not 100% parity with JavaScript API yet. So it might be one of those features that's the methods are there, but it's not implemented yet. I would maybe, one thing we could do is reach out on like Tableau Slack and ask and see if that's an identified bug. I just don't have experience to know whether or not that should or should not be working with version 3.
Okay, thank you.
But otherwise, I mean, great work on this. This is really cool.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. I think
Absolutely.
if you try to reload it again, maybe coming good.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, we've got about 1 minute left. If there's any other questions or anything else, as always. Oh yeah, go ahead, Victor.
Yeah, Kyle. Hi, how are you? Sorry for the last minute, but can I show you my screen a little bit? Just 1 second.
Yeah, I can make you a host. Give me just a second here.
It's
And if
just a
anybody,
question.
I can. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say I can hang on. If anybody else, or Zach, are you currently the host?
Yeah. Maybe
Yeah.
that's
Could you
it.
make Victor a host? If anybody else, needs to drop, we want to be respectful of people's time, but I can hang out, Victor, and take a look with you.
Yeah, I actually do have to drop Kyle, but
Okay.
thanks everybody for sticking around, and I appreciate it, and see you in 2 weeks.
Have a good weekend, everybody. Okay, Victor, you should be able to share now. There we go.
Are you looking at my webpage
Yep,
right
I got
now?
it. Yep, I got
Okay.
it.
So I was just following the tutorial, and I was watching that, for example, for this example that we were working on, it's the resizing is working very well. Like I am changing the height and the width, and it's just like it's perfect. I don't have any problem. But for example, I was trying to work in this one, is mine, but now I'm not having like the same response as the other one here.
So most likely, just immediately from seeing this, the one you have embedded above this one, the dashboard itself is set to a static size. So even though you're telling the Tableau Viz element in your web page to be, whatever by whatever, 300 by 500, whatever it is, the Viz itself is not resizing because you've given it a fixed size. If you were to open the other embedded workbook and look at it, it would have an automatic sizing so that it will fit whatever container that it's in, whether that's on a dashboard, or sorry, whether it's on a screen on Tableau server or whether it's embedded in a web page, it'll react to the container that it's in. Fixed size will not. So you have a container that's a fixed size, but the Viz itself doesn't resize because you told it not to, essentially.
Okay, so it will be recommended to work if I want to embed something in my web page. It will prefer to work in this one in automatic.
If you want it to be reactive to the user's screen, or like to the size of the Viz, the Tableau-Viz element that it's in, yes, you would want to leave it on automatic. Now, what you probably want to do, just as a best practice, if you're doing that, is have like a minimum width, because otherwise, somebody comes in with a really small screen, or they've got, they have their browser only taking up half of a screen. If things get too small, then now your Viz isn't readable anymore. So if you are going to stick with automatic, recommended that you have a minimum size that it will, and you would do that in the embedded portion. Just say, okay, Tableau Viz element, I don't want you to get any smaller than 200 pixels or whatever, because then it becomes unreadable, but otherwise expand as much as you want.
Okay, and where do I configure that minimum size, here or in the JavaScript code?
It would actually be in the HTML. So in your Tableau-Viz element, you could do it inline, doing like style, min width, min height, or you could give it like a CSS class. So where you have div ID Tableau Viz, you could give that a style tag and put in a min width. You could, if you Google CSS min width, you'll see tons of examples. So you could do it inline, you could do it as separate CSS, you could do it however you want.
Okay, I'm just going to put it here to look it at
So-
after.
Yeah, yep, yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, the difference is just the difference in between the two is one is an automatic sizing dashboard and one is not. So one's reactive to size and one isn't.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much for that.
Yep, sounds good. So I do need to go ahead and wrap up. I should probably do some work on a Friday, I guess, but I just want to say thanks again, as always, to everyone who joined, and I hope everyone has a great weekend. And as always, if you have questions, reach out to me or Zach on Twitter or Slack or email. It's all in the slides. We'd love to talk to anybody who wants to talk. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you.